How you doing, guys? Today we're working on the Rugg still. We're getting real close. As you can see, I got the engine laid in place. It's not bolted down yet, but it's in place. We got all the rims and tires back on it. We are missing the transmission, but the rear end is all done. So we're getting there. Things are starting to line up real nice. So today we're going to work on the transmission. Now, in my prior videos, I had indicated that this was probably a peerless transmission. One of the viewers were kind enough to advise me that that was incorrect. It was from another company, and to be honest with you, I should have looked it up. I forgot. But to that viewer, thank you very much for setting me straight, because I'll be honest, I'm not a real professional when it comes to spotting these transmissions out. But in any event, thank you to that individual. It took about 3 of these transmissions to make one good one. If you watched my prior videos where I kind of tore them all apart, you would see or would have seen or maybe recalled the base of this transmission came from another Rugg tractor. The gear set came from the green tractor that I'm working on right now. And this top was from a third Rugg. It just happened to be my brother had this top sitting around, which is an absolutely mint shape. The original top, the bolt holes were stripped out for the shift forks, so that one was wasted. And then the top that came from this base was cracked. It was cracked here and here because the transmission had been filled up with water at one point in time. You can see something got kicked around in the transmission at one time because there's a couple chipped teeth. Let's see, where is it? Let's see. Yeah, right there. A chip. This gear is the only one that's got a couple chips in it. I've set it up for reverse. We'll talk about that later. But the next thing is I made my own gasket because we are going to fill this with gear oil. I guess some of them are filled with bearing grease, but in this application, I'm setting it up for gear oil. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the shafts and the gears out of the lower section of the case. We'll take a look at the lower section of the case, and then we'll slowly but surely start putting the transmission back together. With the gear set removed, we can take a look at the lower case and see that there's a large bronze bushing in the base of the case. It does have like with squared off edges, so it locks into this sort of oval inset in the base of the case, so I guess that keeps it from spinning at some point. There is an oil seal right there that has been replaced. It's the same oil seal. Get a load of this. It's the exact same oil seal as a wheel horse 8-speed transmission input shaft, if that made a bit of sense. This is the input shaft seal for 8-speed wheel horse transmission, which is the exact same seal required for this. So I replaced that seal. The bushing just slid out, pressed it back in, no big deal. We do have the input shaft itself. I will lubricate that with some engine assembly lube. I'll drop that in, and then right here, there's a groove. There's a snap ring that needs to go on that. That snap ring keeps this input shaft from sliding around. So I'm going to go ahead, drop that in, lubricate it, drop it in, set the snap ring, and then we'll talk about the gear set itself. With the input gear cluster here on the workbench broken down, that's the shaft that actually goes in the back position, or I should say the front position, sorry. The front position. So this is the front of the case, and this is the back of the case. This goes towards the axle, that goes towards the front wheels. Full transparency, I put the input shaft in, and when I put the input shaft in, it did tear, or there was just this fine little piece of black rubber that got hooked up in the, right there, got hooked up in the snap ring groove. I had no choice to kind of push it in, and so this thing's probably going to leak, but we'll if it does, we'll tear it apart, get another seal. No big deal. In general, when we're looking at the input cluster gear, we have these two like sun gears, I guess you would call them. They ride on the input shaft itself. We do have this gear here, which is held in with a Woodruff key, as well as this gear is held in with a Woodruff key. The reverse gear is actually free spinning on this shaft. Okay, there's no Woodruff key because it engages a gear on the output shaft cluster, which is pinned or Woodruff keyed into that shaft, and then goes out the gear. The big thing about these that I've learned is that you have to have the whole thing together with the bushings. These bushings are the ones that drop into this position. Oops, wrong way again. I do that all the time too. I always put them in the wrong way. It goes in like this. And then once we get it all situated in, at that point in time, we put the final snap rings and O-rings on the end to hold the gear lube in. I am going to take a little tiny bit of sealer and put it right here on the edge. I'm not going to seal the whole thing, just a little bit right there. So when I actually drop this thing in, it will semi-seal, and then I'll put the top gasket in place, and hopefully it'll keep oil from just weeping out everywhere. All right, so let me get this together and I will show you roughly what it looks like. Okay, so the gear set is put in place. As you can see, I have a snap ring, I have a steel shim, I have a little fiber washer, and then a fuel grade O-ring. So that hopefully will keep the leaking of oil to a minimum. I do have a little Durco sealer, just, like what, maybe 1/4 of an inch band right there. I don't really want to glue it into place in case I ever have to take this thing apart. Same thing on this side, a little bit of Durco sealer just in there. We have a fuel grade O-ring, a little fiber washer, a steel shim, and then we have the actual C-clip. And when we grab it, I can't do it with one hand, but we have a little bit of movement, but overall everything is in good shape. If we kind of twist the input shaft, everything moves real nice and smooth, and there's not a lot of resistance. So I'm going to call this part of it done. Now we're going to go ahead, tear apart the output shaft. There's a bunch of shims and snap rings we got to put in there, as well as some Woodruff keys. So let's take a look at that. Next up is the output shaft. Now this one's a little bit different than the actual input cluster gear, in the sense that we have the actual chain gear hard machined into the end of the shaft. So we've got to be a little bit more cognizant in our layout. We have to start from this side and move towards this end of the shaft, which means we got to put the first, where I had the snap ring here at the end, we got to put the snap ring, we got to put the steel shim, the fiber washer, the O-ring, then the bushing, the reverse gear, then we got to put the Woodruff key, put the Woodruff key, snap ring, Woodruff key, that's the gear slide, that on. Second, snap ring, shim, it just builds up on itself. So for every snap ring, there's a shim, then there's the gear. Okay, snap ring, shim, gear. Then on this side is gear, shim, snap ring, and then we just do it that way. And then we'll clean these up, put a little bit of sealer in, and we'll drop it into the case. Shafts are installed, everything looks good. We got a little bit of sealer on the outsides of these bushings. Now oil will migrate along this inner portion of the bushing to oil the shaft, because I didn't seal that. I probably should have put a little bit of oil on them initially, but I'll wait, and what I'll do is I'll fill this thing up with oil. After this cures, I'll give it a good 24 to 48 hours to cure. I'll fill the tranny up with oil, and I'll kind of like tip it around a little bit and move the shaft so oil will migrate down into this area. I probably should have done that, but it'll be fine. We're not gonna go hog wild with it. But in general, all the slides move real nice. You know, the big thing about this transmission is you never shift it on the fly. That's the thing. You got to be perfectly stopped. You got to get this thing to go into gear, right? You got to turn this shaft a little bit. Let's see here. Turn the shaft a little bit. Let's just check this. There we go. And this thing should lock into place. You know, the clutch forks go into the lid. So we're going to do that. That's what we're going to do next. We're going to start loading the shift forks and other items into the lid. For the shift forks, we have the two forks themselves. One's right here, one's up in here. You can see we have a couple, this is where the bolts that hold them into place goes. These little holes are where the detent balls kind of snap into place to hold the fork in place. The springs are top loaded with the balls, so those go there. These are the little shoulder bolts that go in this position to hold it down, but there is a secondary slide. That secondary slide goes like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm actually going to put a little bit of bearing grease on all this stuff so it slides real nice because it is all dry. It'll eventually get flicked with some oil once we use the transmission, but initially I'm going to put just a little bit of grease on there. I might even use some white lithium grease so it gets broken up by the oil itself, or I can put a little bearing grease there. It doesn't really matter. Just so I can pre-lubricate this so I'm not fighting the forks when I'm trying to put it in gear. I went ahead and coated everything with a little bit of bearing grease, same with the shift forks. I'm also put a little bit of grease in each one of these 4 holes, and there is where the little detent balls get dropped into. So I got to drop those into those little holes. I'm then put the shift forks on top. I'll put a little anti-seize on those bolts. As you can see, they get screwed in 1, 2, 3, 4. Make sure they're good and tight, and then we can flip the cover over and install the shifter. I have the detent springs down the slots. I did put a little bit of grease on those springs just so I know that they're definitely gonna, you know, move or actuate without binding up. The shifter spring, which goes on next, I did put a little bit of grease on each one of the tangs. I also greased up the ball end of the shifter, so that will slide hopefully fairly good. And I put a little grease on the cap where it rides on the ball. I also got a little anti-seize on these 4 screws that hold the whole assembly down. So basically this guy gets laid on like this, in this fashion. The cap goes down onto the shifter, and then the whole thing gets laid inside this, I guess, spring cup area. And then each one of those bolts gets started and then just slowly just cinch the whole thing down. So let me get to that, and in theory, the cover is done. I have fresh 80W90 gear lube, you know, right up to about where the shafts are, just below the shafts. That's more than enough gear lube to keep this thing lubricated because all the gears are bathed in the oil. So as soon as they start to turn, they're going to draw up that oil, and you can already see some of it is being drawn up as I spun it. I kind of drizzled gear lube all over this. So it's all pretty much pre-lubed and everything spins nice and free. I'm going to get the gasket, drop the I cleaned this surface really well with brake cleaner and a paper towel. I'll clean the cover, the base of the cover. I'm going to just take the gasket, drop it in place, and then drop the cover on. The biggest thing about the cover is the shift forks right there need to go into the slots of the slides. So basically I got to make sure I get the forks in the center into the slides. Pretty simple. I've put the cover on and off a couple times, but get all that in place. I'm going to put a little anti-seize on the bolts, put the bolts into place. I got to get the little chain guard that goes over this gear, put that in place, just snug them, torque them down, and we'll go ahead and we'll put it on the tractor, and we'll see what it looks like. And there it is, back at home. I don't have the 4 bolts that bolt it to the engine plate in place. The transmission's just kind of sitting there. I do have to clean the chain, which is over there on the floor, and install the chain. I think I'm going to install the chain and then bolt the transmission down. But overall, everything looks really nice and clean. As you can see, you know, I have all the bolts in place, the 5/16 bolts that bolt the cover to the base. Where I torqued them to 60 inch-pounds. I put the gasket in dry. The belt guard or the chain guard's in place. That's all ready to go. Shifter detents in and out of the gear selection. Nice and tight and firm and clicks. You can actually hear the clicking. So that should be all good. Everything seems to spin fairly free. Hopefully it just doesn't leak a ton of oil. If it does, then I'll take it apart again and figure that out. But at this moment in time, I don't foresee it leaking. Yeah, there it is. Hopefully you found it interesting, guys. Kind of a different little transmission, kind of a neat transmission. But other than that, we are very close to taking this thing out for a ride. I gotta get some bolts for the motor, bolt the motor down, and then put the belts into place, put the motor deck back on, and then we are off to the races. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. I hope you found it interesting. I find it interesting. I really like actually working on this thing. It's been a really fun project. So hopefully everything continues to go smooth. Please like, share, and subscribe. And as always, until the next video or the next project, you have a great day.